When the last traces of sunlight slipped beneath the crooked line of medieval rooftops, a hush fell over the town like a heavy shroud, a silence so profound it seemed to press upon the very walls of the houses and the stones of the streets. There were no lamps brightening the corners, no hum of carriages lit by torches, and no gentle glow of windows softened by glass, for glass was a rarity and firelight expensive. Instead, darkness came thick and total, swallowing alleys, filling barns, and seeping into the very rafters of thatched roofs. To live in such a place meant that night was not merely an absence of day, but an active force, a cloak of danger and mystery. In those long hours, people moved like shadows, their steps hesitant, as though every stride risked summoning some misfortune from the void. The sun, during daylight, lent a thin veneer of safety, for in its brightness one might at least see the dangers that pressed upon every angle of existence. But at night, those dangers multiplied and concealed themselves in blackness. Even the most ordinary lane could twist into menace, for the narrowness of medieval streets, with their overhanging wooden beams and dripping gutters, seemed to breed echoes and whispers. The gurgle of sewage running down the open channel between houses might be mistaken for a footstep, a breath, or a voice. The creak of a shutter in the wind might swell into the groan of some prowler. Those who dared to walk abroad after sundown often carried not only a lantern but also the pounding fear that they carried their last breath. For the poor peasant whose day had ended with aching hands and a belly rarely filled, the bed was no sanctuary from the threats of darkness. Lying upon straw, listening to the scurry of rats in the corners, he would have heard the world grow still outside, yet the silence itself was dangerous. A town's hush meant that only those with stealth or wicked intent moved through it. The rattling of a distant chain, the sudden barking of a dog, or the call of a watchman marked moments when the cloak of darkness shifted slightly, revealing what one did not wish to see. Those awake by accident, perhaps stirred by thirst or pain, would murmur short prayers to saints, hoping protection might extend until morning. But fear did not belong only to peasants. Within stone walls, nobles too felt unease. Their homes may have been stronger, but they knew all too well how easily a guard might fall asleep, a gate might creak open, or a torch might sputter out. The heavy drapery of their chambers, designed to hold warmth, also smothered light. The vastness of their halls, echoing with each breath, made shadows seem larger and footsteps louder. Even surrounded by attendants and guards, a noble could not silence the ancient dread of night. When candle flames danced too brightly upon carved ceilings, it seemed to paint faces of spirits, ancestors, or enemies, watching from beyond. Travellers dreaded night more than anyone. A pilgrim who set foot on the road after sundown was counted as a fool, for the cloak of darkness in the countryside was deeper still. Beyond the town gates, paths wound through forests where no lantern could chase away the blackness. Branches overhead knotted together, blotting even the dim glow of stars. Wolves howled from unseen ridges, and bandits waited in hollows where no torchlight would betray them. To spend a night outside the walls of a town meant pitting one's frail body against every terror of the wilderness, from hunger and beasts to unseen hands that reached from shadows. So travellers pressed hard to reach an inn before the sun set, even if it meant riding their horses to exhaustion, because one night caught unprotected could mean death. Children felt the dread most purely, for their imagination made the unseen into monstrous shapes. A mother might hush her child with a whispered prayer, telling them that angels watched their sleep, yet even she knew that angels were hard-pressed to guard every soul. And so, families often gathered close together, sleeping not in separate chambers but in one shared space, as though proximity itself could guard against the encroaching dark. Fire embers dimmed to faint glows in the hearth, and above them stretched rafters blackened by smoke, from which crept the faint rustle of bats. In that moment between ember light and total blackness, people often mumbled charms, old words that had lingered from pagan times, small spells against creatures that lurked where no candle could reach. What made darkness so unbearable was its length. In winter, night stretched almost endlessly, and the absence of clocks meant its passage was felt only in restless stirrings and the groan of timbers shifting. Some woke for prayer in the middle of the night, a habit as much of necessity as devotion, for sleep was rarely unbroken. Long hours of wakefulness bred strange thoughts, and men and women alike whispered of demons that came in the hours before dawn, when the air seemed to grow heavy, pressing upon the lungs, or when the silence was so complete it became a sound itself. The mind turned to tales of witches flying or spirits stealing into homes. Many swore that the cloak of darkness itself was alive, a sentient weight eager to smother. Thus, one night, in medieval times, was not an empty span to be endured, but a battlefield of fears, where fire, hunger, beasts, thieves, and spirits all converged. The cloak of darkness was more than a backdrop, it was the very stage upon which human fragility was tested. To close one's eyes and rise again at dawn was no small triumph, but a survival, an act of defiance against a force as ancient as the world itself. Those who lived knew well that each night survived was a gift not guaranteed to return again. And so, as the world settled into silence and the stars spun coldly above, each heart that beat within the sleeping towns beat also with the prayer, "Let this cloak pass, and let the sun rise once more." The sun may have slipped beyond the horizon, cloaking fields and forests in darkness, but within the walls of a medieval home the sense of danger did not fade. Instead, it grew sharper, for those walls made of timber frames packed with mud, or thin planks bound together with nails hammered by tired blacksmiths, were never meant to keep out more than the wind. They could not hold against flames, nor the prowling of thieves, nor even the gnawing of vermin. In daylight, a house stood as a symbol of safety, a roof to gather under after labouring in the fields. Yet when night fell and every creak of the timber grew louder, the people within were reminded of how fragile their shelter truly was. The peasant's hut was the most vulnerable of all. Its walls, patched together with wattle and daub interwoven sticks plastered with mud and straw, looked sturdy enough when the sun shone upon them. But in damp nights the very air seemed to seep through. Cold draughts slipped between the cracks, chilling those who lay on straw pallets. A heavy rain could turn the floor into a slick mess of earth, and in winter ice traced delicate webs across the inside, like fingers of the night reaching in. Smoke from the hearth often filled the room, for chimneys were rare in the poorer dwellings. Instead, the fire sat in the middle of the floor, its smoke escaping through a hole in the roof if the wind was kind. Families breathed this smoke deeply as they tried to sleep, coughing into the dark, eyes streaming, lungs growing heavier with each season that passed. The roof offered no better comfort. Thatched with bundles of straw or reeds, it kept out the worst of the rain but invited danger in silence. Sparks from the hearth could leap upward and lodge themselves in the dry thatch, smouldering unseen while a family slumbered beneath. Entire neighbourhoods were known to vanish overnight in flames, for once one thatched roof caught, fire leapt from house to house as though the wind itself conspired in its spread. People feared this most at night, for in darkness there was no quick escape, no ready buckets of water, no neighbours awake to lend a hand. A whole family could be trapped before they even opened their eyes, their walls of comfort turning to walls of fire. Even the homes of townsfolk and minor craftsmen, sturdier in appearance with their timber beams and plaster, were plagued with weakness. Their upper floors jutted outward over narrow streets, designed to save ground space, but the weight often strained the beams. Groaning noises in the dark might be dismissed as wind, though sometimes it was the house itself complaining under its own structure. Rot crept in unnoticed, and a hard storm could bring down half a wall in the night, leaving the family inside shivering in the open. Doors were thin planks, secured with simple bolts or bars, yet thieves with enough will could pry them loose. Locks, where they existed, were crude and iron costly. A robber, with a strong knife, could make short work of a merchant's sense of safety. Thus, when darkness descended, the town streets did not need to swarm with invaders to feel dangerous. The danger was already inside, written into the very fabric of the houses themselves. For nobles in their stone castles, the sense of fragility was different, but it was no less sharp. Their walls might have been built of rock, quarried and hauled over many miles, thick and unyielding to fire, yet within them draughts prowled like invisible animals. Stone does not warm easily, and at night the chill of the walls sank into the flesh. Great halls, impressive in the day with banners fluttering and torches blazing, became vast, cold caverns by midnight. Without fire, breath clouded the air, and blankets piled high did little to soften the bite of the stone beneath. Even in their chambered rooms, nobles heard rats scratching between stones, owls calling from the battlements, or the faint creak of armor from a guard shifting his weight, each sound a reminder that their fortress was but a barrier against one kind of danger, while countless others still crept in. Animals, too, were part of the medieval home, and they brought with them their own nightly troubles. In the poorest households, cows, pigs, and chickens sometimes shared the single room with the family, both for warmth and protection from thieves. But beasts stirred in the night, snuffling and shifting, their noises blending with the creaks of timbers, until dreams were fractured by sudden waking. Lice lived in the hay where animals lay, fleas jumped from fur to skin, and sickness spread without mercy. Children tossed and scratched in their sleep while mothers murmured prayers over them. Yet no prayer could thicken the walls nor drive out the vermin already within. One might think that in towns, where houses pressed close together, there was safety in numbers, but closeness itself carried danger. Thin walls meant the quarrels of neighbors bled through, drunken shouting echoing across alleys, the sound of blows or the thud of a door. Privacy was unknown, and fear was communal, for if a thief prowled one home, he prowled them all. Fire, once started, did not belong to a single household. It devoured whole lanes. The fragile walls stood side by side, amplifying every weakness, so that one mistake in the night might spell doom for dozens. Yet for all their frailty, those homes were clung to as lifelines, for without them there was only the open dark, the wilds, and the raw elements. To huddle inside, with the walls groaning, the roof whispering with the sound of rats, and the air thick with smoke, was still better than facing the night alone beneath the stars. It was a fragile safety, a thin veil of protection, yet it was all that people had, and as they pulled rough wool blankets to their chins, they knew that at any moment the fragile walls of their home might betray them. But they closed their eyes regardless, praying that the structure would last until dawn, that no flame would find the thatch, that no thief would test the door, that no storm would rattle the beams until they fell. In the fragile embrace of such walls, every night was a gamble, and every morning was a small victory, another chance to see the uncertain light of day. When night deepened, and the fragile walls of medieval homes yielded to silence, another enemy entered with quiet persistence: the cold. It was not a passing discomfort, not a mere shiver to be chased away by pulling the blanket tighter, but a living force that crept through stone and timber alike, gnawed at skin and bone, and often decided whether the sleeper would rise again with the dawn. In a world without central heating, without sealed windows or insulated walls, the cold was not a background condition, it was a danger, as real as a sword or a thief, and it accompanied every night with merciless patience. In the peasant's hut, the fire burned at the center of the earthen floor, its smoke curling upward into the rafters. But a fire could not last forever. Wood was precious, and each log represented hours of labor spent in chopping or gathering. Families could not afford to let flames roar while they slept. Instead, they let the fire gutter low, leaving embers to smolder faintly in the hearth. For a time, the glow provided comfort, a warmth that spread thinly through the cramped room. Yet as the hours passed, the embers dimmed, shadows lengthened, and the night air, sharp, damp, and restless, slipped through cracks in the walls, through gaps in the thatch, under the door, and across the floor. By midnight, the warmth of evening had thinned into a chill that wrapped itself around every sleeper, and by dawn it could feel as though the very earth beneath their straw beds had turned to ice. Children felt it worst, for their small bodies could not hold heat as easily. Mothers tucked them close, wrapping them in scraps of wool or covering them with rough animal skins, yet still they shivered, their breath visible in the dark. Infants were at constant risk, and many a child was lost to what people simply called the cold sickness, a vague name for the fatal combination of chill, weak lungs, and the suffocating smoke of the hearth. Adults fared little better, for the nights of winter could linger like an enemy siege, night after night spent half awake, shifting for warmth, teeth chattering, limbs cramping. To wake at dawn, stiff and sore, was a kind of victory, proof that one had endured what others had not. Even the dwellings of the wealthy were not spared. Stone castles and manors may have offered walls thick enough to keep out raiders, but those very walls held in the cold like a prison. In vast chambers, where tapestries hung and rushes covered the floor, a single fire struggled against the immensity of stone. Flames crackled, casting long shadows, but just a few steps away from the hearth, the air was damp and biting. Nobles slept in heavy furs, buried under layers of woolen blankets, yet they too woke with frozen fingers, lips cracked from dry winter air, and joints stiff from nights spent immobile in order to hold onto a scrap of warmth. Drafts slithered through arrow slits and unshuttered windows, whispering down corridors, chilling servants who tended fires through the night. No fortress, however mighty, could shut out the reach of winter's night. The countryside added its own cruelty. A traveller caught after dark, with no shelter, felt the cold as a predator circling closer. A thin cloak could not bar the wind, nor could boots keep frost from creeping upward through the soles. The cold was no silent companion on the road, it was a voice, hissing in the ears, dulling the senses, persuading weary travellers to sit down, just for a moment, to rest. Many never rose again. For those who lived by seasonal labour, cold was not simply uncomfortable, it threatened survival. To lose strength to chill meant fewer hours in the fields, fewer chances to earn bread, and thus a harsher hunger the following night. Cold shaped the rhythms of sleep itself. People often lay down early, not because they were tired, but because the only way to conserve warmth was to share it. Whole families pressed together on straw pallets, sometimes with animals nearby to lend body heat. This closeness was practical, but it was also oppressive. Sleep came broken, disturbed by coughing, snoring, and the constant shifting of restless limbs. When one stirred to stoke the fire or to tend a child, the rush of cold air from the door or chimney sent shivers across every body in the room. Night was not rest, but a struggle, each hour a negotiation between warmth and exhaustion. In villages, the sound of the cold was its own haunting presence. Frost creaked across wooden beams, wind rattled shutters, and the frozen ground outside echoed with every footfall. In silence, the cold could make the faintest sound carry: the howl of a wolf on a distant ridge, the moan of a tree swaying under weight of ice, the crack of frozen soil splitting. Within that soundscape, people dreamed strange dreams, half born of discomfort, half fed by superstition. Many believed that cold carried spirits with it, that the freezing wind was the breath of wandering souls searching for warmth. Mothers would tell children to cover their ears, lest such spirits creep in while they slept, stealing health or sanity. There was no escape from the chill of the air, no device to keep it at bay, no certainty that one night would be kinder than the next. It was a constant trial, shaping lives, forcing habits, deciding who thrived and who perished. To survive it required endurance, luck, and often the sacrifice of one's own comfort for another's. And as embers dimmed into ash and shadows deepened into silence, the cold settled as master of the night, testing each fragile body until the first pale hint of dawn offered release. If the chill of the night crept through cracks and pressed against the skin, hunger came from within, a dull ache that gnawed at the belly and whispered into dreams. It was not the sort of hunger one satisfies with a late-night snack, for in medieval times food was not a ready thing, not stored in abundance nor neatly preserved for comfort. The labour of the day produced just enough to scrape by, and when evening descended, many lay down to sleep with stomachs half empty, or worse, entirely bare. The endless hunger was a companion as constant as the cold, and it made the night long, restless, and perilous. For the peasant family, supper was often thin gruel made from oats, barley, or rye. Bread, if there was any, was coarse, dark, and heavy with chaff. Meat was a rarity, a luxury reserved for feast days, and milk soured quickly without the art of refrigeration. By the time night arrived, the day's scant meals had long since passed through the body, and the belly growled for sustenance it would not receive. Children cried softly, their hunger sharper than that of their elders, for their small frames demanded nourishment the household could seldom provide. Mothers hushed them with promises that the next day's bread might be better, though she herself knew that tomorrow would likely bring the same gnawing emptiness. In winter, the ache was more brutal. for food stores dwindled quickly. Dried beans, salted fish, or smoked meats stretched thinly across months, and when supplies ran short, the spectre of starvation loomed over every home. Nights were the worst. In daylight, a person could distract themselves with labor, with the rhythms of ploughing, weaving, or mending. But in darkness, there was nothing but the hollow body and the mind's racing thoughts. To lie on straw with hunger pressing against the ribs was to drift into uneasy dreams of banquets, only to wake with sharper pangs and the cold realization that no such feast awaited. Even the wealthy were not entirely spared. Their tables might be spread with meats, pies, and wines, but waste and rot haunted them as well. Without proper preservation, food spoiled quickly. What was roasted in the evening could sour by morning, filling the hall with the odor of decay. Servants whispered warnings about eating meat that looked too dark, bread that smelled too sweet, or fish that had turned the wrong shade. Yet nobles, accustomed to indulgence, sometimes risked it, leading to long nights of stomach pains, vomiting, or worse, food poisoning that could kill before dawn. Thus, the very abundance that shielded them from hunger could become a hidden peril when the night grew long. Travelers faced hunger most cruelly. Inns might promise meals, but the quality was poor, and the price high. Those too poor to afford bread on the road often foraged what they could, roots dug from frozen earth, berries snatched from hedgerows, or small game caught in crude snares. But at night, when all was dark and the fields barren, they had no choice but to endure. A traveller, alone in the woods, would lie by a smouldering fire, his body aching with emptiness, his ears straining at every sound. Hunger was not merely a discomfort in those hours, it was a threat, sapping strength, making eyes heavy, and leaving the body weaker for the dangers yet to come. Hunger also shaped the rhythms of prayer and superstition. Families whispered blessings over their bread, not only out of piety but out of genuine fear that without divine favor the next meal might never come. Some believed that spirits haunted the larder, stealing morsels from the unwary, or that demons entered homes through the chimney to sour milk and spoil grain. At night, when hunger made thoughts feverish, people dreamed of witches draining cows dry, of neighbors casting spells to rob them of their harvest. Fear of hunger blended with fear of the supernatural, so that even the simplest pang of the belly seemed like a curse laid upon the household. For children, hunger carved itself into memory. They learned early to savor crumbs, to scrape bowls clean, to chew crusts until they dissolved into nothing. At night, when their bellies twisted, they whispered to one another of impossible foods, golden apples, honeyed cakes, rivers of milk. Their imaginations, sharpened by want, built dreams more vivid than reality. Yet the waking was cruel. Mothers, hearing such whispers, felt their hearts break quietly, but they could not conjure feasts from barren cupboards. They simply pulled their little ones closer, letting body heat soothe where bread could not. In castles, hunger took on another face. Feasts might overflow with abundance, but they were bound by strict hierarchy. Servants and lower retainers often watched their lords dine richly, only to be left with scraps. At night, these scraps, cold and sparse, barely filled the stomachs of those who had worked hardest to prepare the meal. Hunger gnawed at them in silence. Their bodies weakened even as the echo of laughter drifted from the great hall. To the noble it was merriment, to the servant it was a night spent wrestling the ache of want. The endless hunger was not merely physical, it was psychological. It eroded patience, sharpened tempers, and bred suspicion. In the dark, families quarreled quietly, accusing one another of stealing portions, of eating more than their share. Trust frayed when hunger pressed too long, and as the night stretched on, the hollow belly became an echo chamber for dread. Dread of the harvest failing, of storms destroying crops, of famine spreading through the land like fire. No one, rich or poor, was free from such fear. Thus, when morning came and bread was placed upon the table, it was not just a meal, it was survival, a brief victory against the endless hunger that stalked every night. Yet each dawn carried no promise for the next. Hunger waited patiently, knowing it would return, knowing that as long as nights fell and bellies remained fragile, it would always find a way back into the hearts and bodies of those who lived in the medieval world. When the day's labours were finished and the last light faded, people in the medieval world turned to the hearth for warmth, for light, and for the small measure of comfort it could provide. Yet in that flickering glow lay a danger greater than any thief lurking outside, for fire was both life and death. A single spark could undo everything a family had, consuming not only their fragile walls but entire neighbourhoods in a matter of hours. It was said, in hushed tones, that fire never truly slept, and at night, when all else was still, it prowled silently, waiting for its chance to awaken with fury. The hearth fire, kept low through the night, was meant to guard against the freezing air, to keep embers alive until morning when fresh fuel could be added. But embers have their own will. A careless gust from a poorly shuttered window, the twitch of a dog near the flames, or the tumble of a log settling in the coals could send sparks flying across the rush-covered floor. These rushes, spread to cover dirt or stone, were often dry and strewn with bits of straw, food scraps, and spilled ale-perfect tinder. Families lay in uneasy sleep, half aware of the faint crackle or the smell of smoke, never certain if it was their dream or the warning of fire come to claim them. Thatch roofs were the greatest accomplices of the flame. Dry, brittle, and layered thick, they could be ignited by a wayward spark drifting upward. Once caught, the fire spread invisibly, smouldering before bursting into roaring life. By the time a family realized their roof was ablaze, it was often too late. Children were carried out screaming, livestock driven into the night, possessions abandoned to the inferno. In towns, where houses leaned closely together, the terror multiplied. One roof kindled the next, and the fire leapt eagerly down crooked lanes. Whole districts could vanish by dawn, reduced to smoking ruin. Villagers whispered of towns erased in a single night, their people scattered or dead, because a single spark had been left unwatched. Nobles in castles may have thought themselves safer, yet they too feared the restless fire. Their great halls, though built of stone, were filled with wooden beams, rushes, and tapestries that burned as readily as any peasant's hut. Torches flamed along walls, their smoke curling into the rafters, dripping sparks. Servants hurried to trim wicks and douse coals, yet accidents were inevitable. The larger the hall, the greater the need for light, and the more torches burned through the night. Many lords woke at the sudden cry of fire, and rushed to find smoke curling beneath their chamber doors, the work of a torch left too near a tapestry, or a candle overturned by a servant's careless sleeve. In such moments, rank meant little. Fire was no respecter of titles. Fear of fire shaped every night ritual. People prayed over their hearths, crossing themselves before laying down to rest, murmuring old charms against the blaze. Some left bowls of water nearby, though such defences were pitiful against the fury of flame. Others believed fire was a living spirit, a servant of God when tamed, a demon when let loose, and so they whispered thanks to it, even as they feared it. There were tales of families who failed to show respect to their hearth, and found their homes consumed before dawn, as though the fire itself had taken offence. In towns, the dread of fire was communal. Watchmen patrolled not only against thieves, but also to keep alert for the faint glow of flames. Bells were ready to toll in warning, their sudden clang splitting the night, rousing whole populations into frantic motion. Buckets were passed hand to hand, lines of villagers racing to throw water onto the blaze, often in vain. Children clung to their mothers as men shouted orders, the glow of fire turning their world into a hell of red light and choking smoke. Even those spared the flame bore its terror, for the night after a great fire was filled with nightmares of its return. For travellers, fire was both protector and threat. A campfire in the woods kept wolves at bay and offered warmth against the cold, but it also risked drawing unwanted eyes. Bandits could spot a flicker from far off, creeping closer under cover of darkness, and just as easily, a stray ember could catch in dry grass, spreading before the weary traveller could stamp it out. More than one wanderer perished not from beast or blade, but from the fire he had kindled to keep them away. The endless presence of fire gave the night an uneasy edge. People depended on it utterly, yet they never truly trusted it. They knew it must be fed, but feared what happened if it grew too hungry. They dared not let it die completely, for without it they would freeze, yet each spark risked their very lives. And so they lived in that delicate balance, a dance with flame that continued every evening, every midnight, every long hour until morning. The fire never slept. It watched, it waited, and it reminded the people of the medieval world that safety was never guaranteed. To awaken and find the hearth still smouldering gently, without smoke filling the room or flames racing up the thatch, was another small miracle in a time when every night carried dangers too numerous to count. If fire threatened openly, with sparks and smoke to warn of its hunger, disease crept silently in the dark, unseen yet ever present, slipping into homes and beds with a stealth that fire could never match. To survive, one night in the medieval world was to gamble not only against cold, hunger, and thieves, but also against the invisible forces that coursed through the air, the water, and even the very breath of those lying beside you. Illness was a companion to every household, and at night, when minds were most vulnerable to fear, its presence felt almost spectral, like a haunting that wrapped around every sleeper's chest. In the crowded huts of peasants, sickness spread easily. Families often slept pressed close together for warmth, their bodies sharing not just heat, but the germs and fevers that lingered from one person to the next. A child's cough in the evening could become the rasp of a dying breath by morning, and there was little that parents could do but watch and pray. No medicine of real strength existed for the common people. Remedies were herbs, brewed into teas, charms whispered over the forehead, or the application of poultices that soothed the skin but rarely reached the illness within. At night, as the coughing echoed through the smoky room, mothers clutched their children and fathers whispered prayers. Yet in their hearts they knew that prayer was sometimes all that stood between life and death. The towns were worse still. For narrow lanes and open gutters carried more than filth, they carried pestilence. Rats ran freely through the streets and into homes, their fleas biting sleepers in their straw beds. Few could see the connection, but all knew that where vermin thrived, illness followed. Night after night, families listened to the rustling of tiny claws in the dark, fearing not only the theft of grain but the unseen sickness carried with it. The dread was sharpened by memory, for many remembered times when whole towns had been struck down in days, when fever spread like fire, leaving streets silent but for the tolling of the church bell. Even the mighty castles were not spared. Nobles, though feasting upon finer foods, suffered illnesses of their own. Gout, fevers, and stomach ailments from spoiled meats. Draughty halls invited chills that seeped into bones, turning into pneumonia that often claimed lives quickly, especially in winter. Physicians, with their strange tools and Hume's theory, offered bleedings or poultices that often worsened the condition rather than healing it. In the stillness of night, nobles listened to the moans of their children or their wives, unable to command even their wealth into true health. Titles meant little when disease whispered its way through stone walls as easily as timber. At night, illness was always most feared. Fevers rose in the dark, sweat-dampened straw bedding, and delirious whispers disturbed the silence. People muttered of spirits pressing down on their chest, of witches cursing their bodies, of demons stealing their breath. The explanations varied, but the terror was the same: to feel one's strength leave as the world outside lay helplessly asleep. A child who cried out at midnight might be silent by dawn, their life extinguished as quickly as a candle flame. Families sat vigil, bleary-eyed, unwilling to close their own eyes lest death creep nearer while they rested. Disease shaped not only lives but imagination. Tales spread of the night air, a foul miasma that carried sickness. Windows were shuttered tight to keep it out, though doing so only trapped stale smoke and foul odours inside, breeding yet more sickness. Superstitions thrived in the dark, for people sought reasons where knowledge failed them. A mother might believe her child's fever came because a neighbour cast an envious glance, or because she herself had forgotten to cross herself at the church door. The helplessness of illness gave rise to endless explanations, yet none provided true safety. Travellers, too, feared sickness, for inns were hives of contagion. Beds seldom changed their straw, and each new guest lay upon the sweat and sickness of the last. A pilgrim could go to sleep weary from walking, and wake with a fever that clung for weeks, dragging him closer to death with each passing night. Journeys often ended not at shrines but in shallow graves by the roadside, where other travellers whispered prayers as they passed. The darkness of the road was filled not only with beasts and thieves, but also with the unseen hand of disease, striking silently and without warning. The church bells tolled often, breaking the silence of night to announce another death. Each peal sent a shiver through communities, reminding all that sickness walked among them even now. Some towns tried curfews, forcing people indoors after sunset, but such measures rarely slowed what could not be seen. Priests carried candles and incense to drive away the evil air, their light flickering against the blackness of narrow streets. Yet their presence brought little comfort. People knew that even the holiest of men fell ill, for disease did not heed prayers or titles. To lie down in the medieval night was to accept this haunting. Cold and hunger might gnaw at the body, but disease reached deeper, unseen and unstoppable. A cough, a shiver, a sudden pain in the gut, any might herald the end, and none could be certain that the dawn would find them whole. To survive was fortune, to perish was fate, and each night was another turn of the wheel upon which life dangled precariously. And so, disease became the invisible companion of the medieval world's nights, haunting every breath, every cough, every restless stirring in the dark. To awaken with clear lungs and steady strength was no small gift, but a victory won against an enemy unseen, one that prowled just as restlessly as the cold, the fire, and the thieves outside. If disease haunted the night unseen, its messengers were all too visible, the vermin that shared every bed, every floor, every thatched roof. Few households, rich or poor, were free of their company. Rats, fleas, lice, and bedbugs lived alongside people as though they too had claim to the home. They crept and scuttled in silence, they bit and fed under cover of sleep, and they multiplied endlessly in the cracks of walls and the corners of straw mattresses. To close one's eyes in the medieval world was not to find peace, but to surrender one's body to the crawling multitude that stirred restlessly in the dark. The rat was master of the night. In peasant huts, where grain was stored in sacks or earthen jars, the scurrying of tiny claws was constant. Rats slipped easily through gaps in wattle and door walls or through the thatch above, dropping down silently from rafters. Their teeth gnawed incessantly, grinding at wood, rope, and even bone if it lay unattended. Families lay awake listening to them, hoping the creatures would not creep too close. Yet many awoke to find small gnaw marks on toes, or the remains of food stolen straight from their meagre stores. Worse still, rats carried the fleas that brought plague, though few in those times understood the connection. All they knew was that sickness followed in the wake of vermin, and the sound of rats in the dark was a reminder of death itself prowling nearby. Fleas made the night unbearable in subtler ways. They infested straw bedding, feeding on human and animal blood alike. A family that huddled close together for warmth only made the task easier for the fleas, which leapt swiftly from body to body. Their bites itched fiercely, and scratching often broke the skin, leaving sores that festered. In the silence of night, the sound of scratching was constant, children whimpering, mothers whispering for them to be still, fathers gritting their teeth against the endless irritation. Even nobles in their fine beds were not spared, for furs and feather mattresses hid as many fleas as peasant straw. No rank could escape their reach. Kings and beggars alike woke with bites marking their flesh. Lice, too, were constant companions. They lived in hair and clothing, crawling unseen until the itching grew unbearable. At night, when bodies lay still, lice wandered freely, feeding unnoticed until morning revealed the red trails they had left behind. Women spent hours by daylight combing their children's hair with fine-toothed combs, crushing lice between their nails, but the victory was always temporary. By nightfall, the battle began anew. Even monks and nuns, who lived with stricter cleanliness than most, wrote in their letters of the endless torment of lice, calling them trials sent by God. To lie in bed scratching while prayers were muttered in the dark was a universal experience, a nightly ritual that stretched across all classes and stations. Bedbugs thrived as well, hiding in the cracks of wooden frames, crawling out only when the room grew still. Their bites left swollen marks that burned and itched for days. Unlike fleas, they were harder to detect, moving silently under the cover of darkness. Many peasants believed the bites were curses, inflicted by unseen spirits or witches, for they could find no culprit when they searched by daylight. It was only in the dead of night, when shadows stirred and whispers of scratching filled the air, that people suspected what lurked with them in their beds. The presence of vermin extended beyond irritation. It carried real danger. Rats spread filth, their droppings fouling food stores and drinking water. Fleas carried sickness from animal to human, and lice spread fevers that killed as surely as a sword wound. At night, these dangers multiplied, for people lay helpless, unable to defend themselves against what they could barely see. A child might weaken from repeated bites, their small body unable to withstand constant blood loss and infection. A fever that began with an itch could end in death by morning. Thus, the night of vermin was not only restless but fatal, claiming lives silently under the cover of darkness. Yet vermin were not merely tolerated, they were impossible to defeat. Cats were kept to catch rats, but even the most skilled hunter could not eliminate them all. Dogs barked at scuttling in the walls, but the scratching always returned. People stuffed cracks with rags, burned herbs to drive away fleas, and prayed over their beds, but nothing ever truly worked. In the end, families accepted the presence of vermin as inevitable, just another trial woven into life itself. They cursed them, feared them, and endured them, night after night, with weary resignation. For travellers, vermin were an even greater torment. Inns seldom replaced bedding, and each new guest inherited the fleas, lice, and bedbugs of countless sleepers before. A weary pilgrim might collapse onto straw only to be woken an hour later by crawling bites that kept him scratching until dawn. The poor who slept in barns found themselves sharing space not only with livestock, but with the rats that thrived in the grain stores. Many whispered that a night in an unfamiliar bed was riskier than a night in the open, for at least under the stars one might avoid the vermin that thrived indoors. Nobles, too, faced nightly battles against vermin, though they cloaked the reality in silks and ceremony. Their feather mattresses, costly and luxurious, became nests for lice and bedbugs, their furs alive with fleas. Servants were charged with beating bedding and combing garments, but even the grandest chamber could not keep pests entirely at bay. Behind the glitter of candlelit halls lay the same restless scratching and whispered prayers, the same bruised skin and sleepless hours endured by peasants below. The night of vermin spared no one, for vermin did not respect gold, stone walls, or tapestries. They thrived wherever humans did, and they waited most eagerly for the stillness of sleep. And so, each medieval night was lived in uneasy alliance with creatures that crawled and bit in silence, tormenting bodies, spreading illness, and reminding all of the fragility of their existence. To awaken with fewer bites than the night before was considered a small mercy, just as to find food unspoiled by rats was counted a blessing. In this way, vermin became part of the rhythm of life, hated yet accepted, endured yet never conquered. They were the silent companions of darkness, and their reign extended unbroken across every bed where weary souls tried in vain to rest. If hunger gnawed at the belly, and vermin crawled across the skin, it was fear that pressed most heavily upon the mind during a medieval night. Darkness was never empty. It was thick with presence, filled with whispers of spirits, demons, and things unseen that stirred when the sun vanished. To close one's eyes in that time was not merely to surrender to sleep, but to expose oneself to a realm believed to be shared with the dead, the damned, and the supernatural. The weight of fear lay upon every chest, heavier than blankets, colder than draughts, and it stretched each night into an ordeal that tested both faith and sanity. Superstition was the language through which people explained the inexplicable. If a child woke screaming in the dark, mothers might whisper of a demon pressing upon its chest, a night hag that stole breath from sleepers. If a man awoke drenched in sweat, thrashing against a weight he could not see, it was said that witches had ridden him, or that spirits had visited in envy or vengeance. Sleep paralysis, unknown by name, was instead a visitation from something evil. These beliefs were not idle fancies. They were explanations born of fear in a world where knowledge was scarce and night magnified every uncertainty. Church bells and priests offered some comfort, but even faith could not fully banish fear. The medieval church itself spoke often of devils and restless souls, teaching that demons prowled the earth in search of the weak. At night, when prayers had been said and candles snuffed, the silence pressed too heavily for such warnings to be ignored. People crossed themselves before lying down, whispered Ave Marias, or hung charms by their beds. But when the wind howled like a voice or a shutter banged like a hand at the door, even the faithful felt dread seep into their bones. Every creak of timber became suspect, every rustle in the thatch a messenger of something unnatural. The moan of wind through a chimney sounded like a wail. The sudden cry of an owl carried the omen of death. Dogs, more attuned to movement than humans, barked into the night, their teeth bared at nothing visible. Yet in those moments their masters were certain. Something unseen lingered just beyond the threshold. Fear twisted the ordinary into the sinister, and the human imagination painted shapes where none existed. The countryside held even greater terrors. In the vast silence beyond town walls, the dark was not only deeper but also filled with legends of wandering spirits. Crossroads were said to be haunted by those denied Christian burial, fields by the ghosts of murdered men. Travellers spoke of lights in the wood's willow, the wisps that led the unwary to their deaths. To hear laughter in the distance, or to glimpse movement where no one should be, was enough to make even hardened men clutch at their crucifixes. Fear was not abstract. It was immediate, palpable, and reinforced by countless stories handed down from generation to generation. Children absorbed these tales early, learning to fear shadows long before they could name them. Mothers told them of demons who stole naughty children away, of witches who crept through keyholes, of fairies that lured the curious into eternal night. These stories were meant to keep them safe, to warn them against wandering, but they also ensured that every creak in the rafters, every flutter of a moth near the candle, was interpreted as a threat. For children, night was a theatre of terrors, where the mind conjured horrors far worse than any reality. Even nobles, in their fortified castles, felt the weight of fear. Their stone walls could bar men and beasts, but they could not guard against what was unseen. Many noble families kept chaplains who prayed through the night, believing their words might shield the household from the devil's reach. Yet nobles too woke sweating from nightmares, convinced they had glimpsed a shadow at the foot of their bed, or heard whispers from ancestors long dead. The larger the halls, the more room there was for the imagination to populate with ghosts. The echo of footsteps down a corridor could as easily be a servant as a spectre, yet at night, who could truly be sure? Fear was not confined to the imagination, it shaped behavior. Many dared not leave their homes after sunset, convinced that to walk in the dark was to invite evil upon themselves. Villagers avoided graveyards at night, fearing the dead might walk. Travellers hurried to find shelter before twilight, lest they be caught on the road where witches and demons were said to roam. In towns, curfews kept people inside, not only for safety from thieves but also to quiet the dread that filled streets when all was dark. The fear was communal, woven into the rhythm of life, each night a reminder that the world was never as simple as it seemed in daylight. And so the weight of fear pressed upon every soul, bending sleep into restlessness, turning shadows into omens, and whispers into threats. To survive the night was not only to endure hunger, cold, and vermin, but also to endure the imagination itself, which in darkness became sharper, crueler, and less forgiving. Morning was not just a return of warmth and work. It was a release from the heavy hand of terror that sat upon the chest of every medieval sleeper, a moment when the unseen horrors retreated into shadow and the world, for a few hours, felt safe again. If vermin were constant companions and fear was bred from shadows, the presence of strangers brought a sharper, more immediate peril to medieval nights. Darkness was the ally of thieves, beggars turned desperate, and wandering men without honest trade. In daylight, even the poor might find some measure of safety in crowds, in watchful neighbours, or in the authority of local lords. But when the sun dipped beyond the horizon, and the cloak of night spread across fields and towns, the roads and alleys became a realm where the desperate and the lawless held sway. To hear a knock at one's door after sundown was enough to freeze the heart, for it was rarely good news that travelled in darkness. The peasant family, huddled in their fragile hut, feared more than the cold when night fell. A weak door barred with a simple beam of wood was little obstacle to a thief seeking food, clothing, or coin. Many slept lightly, ears tuned to the smallest sound beyond their threshold. A snapped twig, a muffled footstep, the low murmur of voices could stir panic. Fathers kept crude weapons, an axe, a pitchfork, or a club within reach of their bed, ready to defend their household if strangers forced their way in. Mothers prayed softly that the prowlers would pass by, leaving their home unmolested. But prayers did not always suffice. Many awoke to find stores of grain stolen in the night, livestock driven off, or worse, violence brought upon their family by hands unseen in the dark. Townsfolk lived with a different fear. Narrow alleys and shadowed corners made ideal hiding places for cut purses and brigands. By day, merchants' stalls and chatter filled the streets. But by night, the same lanes belonged to those who thrived on stealth. To walk abroad after sunset was to risk ambush, a knife at one's back, or the sudden grip of hands tearing away purse and cloak. Watchmen patrolled with lanterns, their calls echoing through the streets, yet their presence was thin and scattered, and thieves were clever at slipping away into darkness. A shout for help might go unanswered, for no neighbor wished to invite danger to their own door. In this way, towns at night were not places of fellowship but of isolation, where each family shut itself in and prayed no stranger came knocking. On the open road, the peril multiplied. Travelers who dared to journey by moonlight often found themselves prey to bands of robbers who knew the paths too well. Forests and hedgerows offered cover, and every bend in the road was a place where strangers might lie in wait. Pilgrims bound for holy shrines often banded together for safety, yet even groups were sometimes overwhelmed. Tales abounded of inns along lonely highways where the innkeepers themselves conspired with thieves, luring travelers into rest only to rob them in their sleep and dispose of them before dawn. To be caught unprotected on the road after sunset was to gamble one's life, for hunger, cold, and beasts were dangers enough without the addition of desperate men. Even the wealthy behind castle walls were not free of fear. Intruders could be bribed from within, or gates left ajar by disloyal servants. Bandit lords, emboldened by weakness in authority, sometimes laid siege to manors under cover of night, striking quickly before defenders could muster. For nobles, the threat of strangers was not only theft but betrayal, for the very men sworn to protect them might be tempted by gold to turn assassin. A noble waking in the night to the sound of steel clashing in the courtyard could never be certain whether the threat lay without or within. Strangers were feared not only for theft and violence but for what they might bring with them. Vagabonds, wanderers, and beggars were often viewed as carriers of disease, their presence in villages seen as a curse upon the community. To open one's door to a knock in the dark was to risk inviting sickness into the home. Many turned such people away with harsh words or stones, fearing that to offer shelter would doom their children. Yet the guilt lingered, for Christian duty demanded hospitality, even as fear urged caution. The conflict between faith and survival was felt most sharply when the sound of a stranger's voice carried through the dark. Fear of strangers also fed superstition. Stories told of spirits that took the form of men, wandering roads at night to trick the living. To meet a stranger on a lonely lane after sunset was sometimes believed to be no man at all, but a demon testing the soul. Villagers told tales of travelers who vanished after sharing bread with such figures, never to be seen again. Whether such stories were true or not, the weight of them shaped the choices of many. They stayed indoors, barred their doors, and taught their children never to speak to those who called from the shadows. Thus, each night in the medieval world was a time when the dangers of strangers loomed as large as hunger or cold. Homes were locked not only against the wind but against human malice. Roads emptied as twilight fell, leaving only the brave or the desperate still abroad. Trust, so necessary in daylight, gave way to suspicion, for in the dark no man could be certain whether the figure approaching was friend, foe, or something far worse. To survive until morning meant not only resisting the elements but avoiding the hands of those who prowled when all else slept. If strangers haunted the night with hidden knives and greedy hands, then beasts haunted it with teeth and claws, voices raised in cries that froze blood in the veins of every listener. For in the medieval world, the wilderness was never far, and beyond the thin walls of homes and towns lay forests and fields where creatures prowled freely. By day, men worked the earth and kept beasts at bay with noise and labor, but at night, when plows lay silent and fires dwindled, the balance shifted. Then the animals claimed the darkness as their domain, and their howls, growls, and shrieks filled the air with reminders that mankind was only one creature among many, and not always the strongest. The wolf was the most feared of all. Its mournful cry echoed across hills and through forests, a chorus that could travel miles. To hear it in the stillness of night was to be reminded that predators circled the village, waiting for weakness. Wolves did not often break into towns, but they prowled the edges, drawn by the scent of livestock. A poorly barred pen or a wandering goat could invite a raid, and by morning only blood and tracks remained. Families woke to the sound of animals crying out, rushing to defend their meager herds, yet often finding themselves too late. Worse still were the tales of wolves emboldened by hunger, venturing closer to human dwellings, even dragging off children who had strayed outside after dusk. These stories, whether wholly true or not, etched terror into every listener, so that even the faintest howl made mothers clutch their children tighter under their blankets. Wild dogs added their voices to the night. Descended from strays and abandoned animals, they roamed in packs, scavenging and hunting with a savagery born of desperation. They slunk into towns, digging through refuse, snarling at anyone who tried to chase them off. Their barking, sharp and sudden, could wake a whole household, setting hearts racing with the fear that thieves or wolves were near. Unlike wolves, wild dogs were more unpredictable, sometimes attacking in bursts of frenzy, their eyes glowing in torchlight like the eyes of demons themselves. Travelers feared them greatly, for on the lonely road there was little defense against a pack, save fire or sheer luck. Bears still roamed in certain regions, and their presence in the night was more rare but no less terrifying. A growl carried on the wind, the sound of branches breaking under heavy steps, could send entire villages into fearful silence. Few had the weapons or the numbers to challenge such a beast, and if it entered a settlement seeking food, it left behind devastation, overturned hives, slaughtered animals, and sometimes even broken doors where it had clawed its way in. Though rare, the memory of such encounters lingered for generations, retold by firelight as warnings against the dangers of wandering too far from safety after dusk. The countryside was filled with smaller threats as well. Owls called with eerie cries that many believed were omens of death. Foxes screamed with a sound so like a human wail that villagers swore they were the voices of witches or wandering souls. Bats fluttered in rafters, their wings brushing against hair and skin in the dark, mistaken for spirits in search of victims. Even harmless creatures became fearful in the night, for every noise carried a weight it lacked in daylight. The unknown made all animals suspect, and the darkness gave them a voice larger than life. Livestock, the lifeblood of peasants, were particularly vulnerable. Chickens, sheep, goats, and pigs were often kept in pens close to the house or even inside the dwelling itself, but this did not guarantee their safety. The sudden squeal of a pig in the night, or the frantic clucking of chickens, could mean a predator was already within reach. Families leapt from their beds, stumbling in the dark to drive off intruders, sometimes finding only a shadow slipping away with their livelihood clamped in its jaws. Each loss was more than meat or milk. It was survival slipping into the jaws of the wild. For travelers caught outside at night, the sounds of beasts were a torment unlike any other. A wolf's howl carried across valleys, and every rustle of brush became a possible attack. A lone horseman might feel his mount stiffen, ears pricked, at scents he could not detect. To build a fire was to offer some protection, but flames could not silence the sounds that circled in the darkness. Many a weary soul sat awake until dawn, clutching a knife, praying that no glowing eyes would appear beyond the edge of the firelight. Some never lived to see the sunrise, their fate marked by blood and tracks in the morning dew. Fear of beasts bled into legend. Villagers spoke of monstrous wolves, larger than horses, sent as punishment for sin. Tales of werewolves spread, men cursed to roam as beasts under the moon, their howls louder and more fearsome than any natural creature. Whether true or not, Such stories amplified the terror of every cry in the night, until even the smallest whimper of a fox could become, in the imagination, the roar of something supernatural. The wilderness was more than a physical danger. It was a spiritual threat, a reminder of forces beyond human control. And so, when the howls rose into the midnight air, when growls rumbled just beyond the reach of torchlight, every heart in the medieval world felt the weight of being prey. Behind thin walls and barred doors, people lay awake, straining to hear if the danger crept closer. To awaken with livestock intact, with children safe, with no signs of claw or tooth upon the threshold, was to have survived another night in a world where beasts roamed freely and men lived always within reach of their hunger. While most families lay uneasy in their huts, pressed together for warmth, or nobles pulled their furs tight in draughty chambers, there were always those who could not surrender themselves to even restless sleep, the watchmen, keepers of the night. Their burden was heavy, for the safety of many rested upon their weary eyes. They were the fragile line between townsfolk and thieves, between farms and wolves, between peace and sudden terror. To be a watchman in the medieval night was not a privilege but a test of endurance, a long and lonely vigil where the body yearned for sleep, yet the world demanded wakefulness. In towns, watchmen patrolled crooked streets, their lanterns bobbing faintly in the gloom. They carried staves, sometimes swords, though their weapons were often less feared than the dangers they faced. Their duty was not only to look for thieves but also to guard against fire, to listen for shouts of distress, to ensure curfews were kept. Yet how could one man with a lantern hope to pierce the depths of darkness that stretched between alleys, doorways, and roofs? Their footsteps echoed through emptiness, and in that echo lived the knowledge that shadows might conceal what their eyes could not. Many walked with prayers muttered beneath their breath, warding off spirits and asking for courage. To falter was to risk not only their own lives, but the lives of those who trusted them to remain vigilant. The burden weighed heavier in winter. Bitter winds cut through wool cloaks, numbing fingers even when wrapped around a lantern's handle. The cold seemed to freeze sound itself, so that the crack of a distant twig carried sharp and sudden, magnifying fear. Watchmen stamped their feet, paced restlessly, tried to sing to themselves to stay awake. Yet fatigue was a greater enemy than cold. Hours stretched endlessly, and eyelids grew heavy. Tales abounded of guards who nodded at their post only to awaken to disaster. Thieves already inside the town, a fire leaping from roof to roof, or worse, raiders descending in silence. To fail in one moment of drowsiness was to bring ruin, and so the fear of sleep itself gnawed at watchmen more than the beasts beyond the walls. In villages, the burden was shared. Not every hamlet could afford men to keep watch, so peasants took turns, each family sending a father, brother, or son to patrol. These men, already exhausted from days of labor in the fields, faced the night with bleary eyes and stiff limbs, holding clubs or spears fashioned from farm tools. They walked the boundaries, listening for the cry of animals or the rustle of wolves. Their presence was less a guarantee of safety than a ritual of reassurance, a sign that the village was not wholly abandoned to the dark. Yet each man knew, as he paced the silent lanes, that he was poorly armed against thieves, and even less prepared for raiders or beasts. Still, he walked, for to refuse was to invite suspicion and anger from neighbours, who feared the absence of vigilance more than the weakness of it. Even castles, with their thick walls and gates of iron, demanded their watch. Guards stood upon battlements, peering into the black countryside below. Torches flickered in the wind, barely illuminating the stones at their feet, while the fields beyond remained vast and empty, or so they seemed. Every shadow could conceal an enemy. Every shifting shape might be a scouting party, every cry of a night bird perhaps a signal. To hold a post upon the wall was both an honour and a punishment, for though it marked trust, it also condemned the guard to long hours of icy wind and endless suspicion. Whispers told of armies that crept close under cover of darkness, overwhelming sleeping fortresses before dawn. No guard could forget those tales, and so each shadow kept him taut with unease. The burden of watchmen was more than physical, it was psychological. Alone in the night, they bore the weight of every possible disaster. If fire came, it was their fault for not seeing the spark. If thieves entered, it was their negligence that allowed it. If beasts stole livestock, they were accused of not hearing the cries. Every villager slept under the fragile comfort of knowing someone else remained awake, and when calamity struck, that comfort turned into accusation. Thus, the watchman's night was one of responsibility greater than his own strength, a burden no man could carry without dread. The fear of spirits weighed on them as well. Watchmen swore they saw figures slip between shadows, only to vanish when approached. Some told of hearing whispers that mocked them, voices just beyond reach, luring them toward empty lanes. Others claimed to see lights in graveyards, or shapes crouching on rooftops. Whether these were tricks of fatigue or the work of imagination, the effect was the same: terror that pressed with every passing hour. Alone, surrounded by silence, even the bravest heart began to falter, and many returned from their shift with faces pale and voices trembling, though they spoke little of what they had seen. The burden was greatest for those on the open road. Watchmen placed at gates or crossroads bore the task of deciding who might enter after sunset. Strangers who begged for shelter could be thieves in disguise or carriers of disease. To turn them away risked damnation, for Christian charity demanded kindness, but to admit them could bring ruin. Each knock at the gate was a choice that weighed heavily, for it might determine the survival of the entire settlement. Many a watchman lived with guilt for years, remembering the night he had admitted the wrong stranger, or the night he had refused mercy to someone who truly needed it. And so, as villagers slept restlessly in their beds, as nobles dozed in draughty chambers, as travellers huddled by sputtering fires, the watchmen remained awake, pacing, shivering, listening, fearing. Their eyes grew heavy, their bodies ached, but they dared not falter. Theirs was a night without rest, a vigil against forces greater than themselves: fire, thieves, beasts, or spirits. And every dawn that broke with the village still standing was a testament not only to chance and mercy, but also to their weary endurance. If the towns were restless with noise, the shuffle of watchmen, the bark of dogs, the cough of sleepers, then the countryside held a silence of an entirely different nature. Beyond the gates, in the fields and forests, there stretched an emptiness so complete that it pressed against the ears like weight. In daylight, the countryside was alive with birdsong, with the creak of cartwheels, with the distant call of a ploughman to his oxen. But at night, those sounds vanished. What remained was a vast stillness, broken only by the occasional cry of a beast or the sigh of wind through branches, each noise magnified by the surrounding void. It was this silence, as much as wolves or thieves, that made the countryside terrifying after sunset, a silence so deep it seemed unnatural, as if the land itself was holding its breath. For the peasant whose hut lay on the edge of the fields, this silence was not comforting but oppressive. When the hearth fire burned low and the last voices had faded, he could hear every rustle outside his walls: the scratching of a hedgehog in the leaves, the flap of an owl's wings, or the distant snap of a twig became sinister in the absence of other sound. Each noise felt deliberate, a sign of something or someone moving unseen in the dark. The silence was never truly empty. It was pregnant with possibilities, and in it the imagination worked ceaselessly, conjuring visions of thieves, beasts, or spirits just beyond the threshold. Travellers caught on the road felt the silence even more sharply. Alone on a path that wound through woods or fields, the night became a heavy cloak that blinded and deafened. The stars gave little light through branches, and the moon, when it appeared, only deepened shadows. In that stillness, the sound of one's own breathing grew loud, the crunch of boots on earth almost unbearable. Every pause in movement stretched into dread, for in silence, the absence of sound felt as threatening as sound itself. Many swore they heard footsteps following them, timed perfectly with their own, though no figure ever appeared. The countryside at night was not merely empty. It was alive with absence, with the sense that something unseen was always just out of sight. Villages scattered across the landscape seemed like islands in this ocean of quiet. Their faint lights shone like beacons for miles, promising safety but also attracting danger. A glow on the horizon could signal warmth and fellowship, or it could be the lure of a trap, an inn where thieves waited, or a place where strangers were not welcome. Between those islands stretched miles of silence, and to cross them was to step into a void where no human voice could reach, where cries for help would vanish into the air unheard. Many chose to sleep rough in the open fields, rather than risk walking further, even though lying exposed brought its own dangers of cold, beasts, and discovery by robbers. This silence was not without spiritual weight. The medieval mind, steeped in faith and superstition, often interpreted it as the presence of unseen forces. The countryside at night was thought to belong not to men but to spirits, fairies, and demons. Silence was their veil, their warning that humans were intruding upon their domain. Many peasants told stories of hearing bells in the distance where no church stood, or music drifting over meadows with no source. Some swore that the silence could suddenly deepen, so profound it felt like being submerged in water, and in those moments they believed the otherworld pressed close. To survive such encounters, they muttered prayers or clutched talismans, desperate to remind themselves that God still watched even in the absence of sound. Even nobles who travelled with escorts felt the dread of this silence. Their men-at-arms might carry torches, their horses might stamp and snort, but beyond that ring of movement lay the same vast, oppressive quiet. The clink of armour seemed too loud, a beacon to whatever prowled unseen. Knights returning from campaign wrote of night rides through forests where no bird sang, no wolf howled, where the silence itself felt hostile, as though the earth conspired to swallow them whole. For men trained to fight with sword and shield, there was no enemy more unnerving than this intangible void. The silence of the countryside also brought a practical danger: disorientation. Without landmarks visible in the dark, travellers lost their way easily. Roads twisted into one another, hedges and trees became indistinguishable, and soon a man could find himself walking in circles, each step taking him further from safety. The silence provided no guidance, no sound of distant voices or water to orient by. Many were lost this way, their bodies found days later in fields or woods, victims not of attack but of the silent emptiness itself. For those within villages, the silence was broken only by sudden, sharp sounds that shattered the stillness. A wolf's howl, distant yet piercing, the bark of a dog roused to alert, the crash of branches as something large moved unseen. These noises did not reassure but magnified dread, for they reminded all that the silence was not true emptiness, but a mask beneath which danger prowled. Families huddled closer, grateful for the presence of others, for alone in the countryside such sounds could drive a man to madness. Thus, the silence of the countryside was as dangerous as cold, hunger, or thieves. It disoriented the body, unsettled the mind, and invited the imagination to conjure endless terrors. Each night that passed within it was endured, not enjoyed, for the void pressed heavy upon the heart. To survive, it was to resist not only beasts and bandits, but the weight of emptiness itself, the silence that swallowed all comfort and reminded men of their fragility in a world too vast, too dark, and too full of unseen forces. If the silence of the countryside smothered the senses, it was the sudden strike of illness in the night that smothered hope. For in the medieval world, sickness was a constant companion, but when it arrived after sundown, its power seemed multiplied, pressing families into helplessness. The remedies available were fragile, uncertain, and often more dangerous than the illness itself. In the hours when priests slept, when physicians were far away, when the apothecary's door was locked and the herbs lay dry upon their shelves, a cough could deepen into a death rattle, a pain in the belly into fatal convulsions. The weakness of medicine made the night a place of terror, where even the strongest might be brought low without warning. For peasants, the first defense against illness was the store of folk remedies handed down through generations. A child with fever might be wrapped in damp cloths or placed near the fire to sweat it out. A man with a festering wound might have poultices of herbs pressed upon it, or ashes sprinkled to dry the pus. Women brewed teas of chamomile, sage, or valerian, hoping to calm pain or coax sleep, but such remedies did little against true disease. When sickness struck with force, when coughing fits racked the chest, when stomach cramps bent the body, when blood flowed without stopping, families had no choice but to pray. Their homes were too far from physicians, and even if one could be summoned, his remedies offered little more certainty. In the dark, the sounds of the sick were heavy, the gasping for air, the groans that broke the silence, the whispers of loved ones pleading with heaven. In towns, access to healers was more common, yet the results scarcely better. Medieval medicine rested on theories of humours, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and illness was thought to arise when these fell out of balance. The cure was often worse than the ailment: bleeding with knives or leeches to drain excess blood, purges to clear imagined blockages, or draughts of strong herbs that burned the stomach. At night, by the light of a candle, these procedures carried even greater danger, performed hastily, hands trembling in shadow, the patient already weak. Many did not survive the cure, and families wondered bitterly whether it was the illness or the healer that carried their loved one away. Even nobles, with access to learned physicians, felt the limits of medicine. Their chambers might be filled with exotic powders, rare herbs from distant lands, and physicians trained in monasteries. Yet when fever gripped a noble child or childbirth turned to crisis, these resources often proved useless. A physician might prescribe the burning of incense to drive out bad air, or the wearing of jewels believed to balance humours. But the illness laughed at such measures. At night, the halls of castles echoed with the cries of the sick, and lords and ladies, for all their wealth, could do nothing but pace and pray, waiting to see if dawn would bring improvement or death. The terror of nighttime illness was sharpened by ignorance. Without clocks or measures of time, families waited in endless darkness, unable to mark progress or decline. Hours stretched unbearably as they tended the sick, changing cloths, offering water, whispering prayers. Each cough sounded louder in the stillness. Each groan seemed longer. Mothers sat upright through whole nights, holding their children against their breasts, hoping that warmth might drive away the sickness. Fathers, powerless, turned to saints for intercession, hanging crosses or relics above the bed. But saints were silent, and disease advanced regardless of faith. Superstition filled the gaps where medicine failed. Many believed illness at night was the work of witches, who slipped into homes under cover of darkness to curse the living. A sudden fever was blamed upon an envious neighbour, a wasting sickness upon a hex. Families hung charms above doors, sprinkled holy water upon thresholds, or lit candles through the night to keep evil at bay. Yet when the illness persisted, fear turned inward. Perhaps it was a punishment from God, a judgment for sins unconfessed. Guilt weighed heavily in those dark hours, adding spiritual torment to physical suffering. Travellers who fell ill on the road suffered worst of all. Far from family, with no bed but the hard ground of an inn or the cold earth beneath the stars, they endured sickness alone. A fever could burn through them with no hand to cool the brow, no voice to comfort. Inns provided little aid, their keepers fearing contagion. Many were cast into barns or fields to die, their last sounds swallowed by the night. Passing pilgrims might find such figures by dawn, whispering prayers for their souls before moving on, knowing too well that they themselves might meet the same fate. The weakness of medicine meant that night itself became a test of survival. A man who went to bed with a cough might never rise. A woman in labour might face hours of agony, her family helpless to aid her. A child burning with fever might slip away before the rooster crowed. Each night was a vigil, an anxious waiting for signs of recovery that seldom came. Morning was greeted with relief, not only because it brought light, but because it brought access to help, however meagre that help might be. In this way, illness haunted the medieval night with a presence as oppressive as fear or hunger. The remedies were frail, the knowledge incomplete, the prayers unanswered more often than not. To live through a night of sickness was as much a miracle as to escape fire or thieves. The weakness of medicine was not only a flaw of the time, but a shadow that lengthened every evening, reminding all who lay down to rest that the body was fragile, that disease was merciless, and that survival until dawn was never guaranteed. If peasants endured nights of cold, vermin, and hunger within their fragile huts, one might think nobles, surrounded by stone walls and servants, slept more soundly. Yet the truth was otherwise. The bedchambers of lords and ladies, though draped in tapestries and furs, were far from havens of comfort. Castles, for all their strength against raiders, were uneasy places to rest at night, echoing with draughts, shadows, and the memory of enemies both within and without. The noble's bed was often high and wide, yet the sleep it offered was shallow, broken by anxieties that no blanket of silk could ward away. The very size of castles turned against their inhabitants in the dark. By day, banners and torches filled the halls with grandeur, but when night fell and the last fires dimmed, those same halls became vast caverns of gloom. The stone walls, cold and unyielding, radiated chill long after hearths burned out, and draughts crept through arrow slits and along staircases like invisible spirits. A noble lying in bed might pull layers of furs upon himself and still feel the cold gnaw at his bones. Each gust of wind whistling through cracks in the masonry sounded like a sigh, each echo of footsteps in distant corridors like the approach of something unseen. The silence was not a balm but a burden, for it magnified every sound until the castle seemed filled with whispers and groans. Servants did their best to prepare the chambers for sleep, setting braziers with glowing coals, lighting candles, and arranging heavy curtains around the bed. But candles guttered, curtains shifted, and coals dimmed too soon. As the castle darkened, the noble was left with a space that seemed less like a sanctuary and more like a mausoleum. Nobles themselves wrote in journals of nights, when sleep was impossible, when shadows played upon the tapestries in shapes too much like advancing figures, when silence deepened into dread. Even the wealthiest lords, armored in gold and guarded by men, could not armor their minds against the weight of night. The unease was not only born of the imagination, it was grounded in very real threats. Nobles lived in constant fear of betrayal. The higher their rank, the more enemies they had. Rival lords, ambitious relatives, discontented servants. Many nobles went to sleep knowing that daggers could find them not through the walls of a besieged castle, but through the treachery of those within. Servants moved quietly in the halls, and while most were loyal, suspicion was a constant companion. A creak outside the chamber door might be nothing more than a guard shifting his stance, but it might also be a conspirator with murder in mind. Sleep, under such conditions, was never deep. Nobles often woke suddenly, listening for sounds that might confirm or dispel their unease. Even when the castle itself was safe, the threat of war pressed heavily on the minds of those within. Lords lay awake imagining torches appearing on the horizon, the call of horns breaking the silence, the crash of rams against their gates. In times of conflict, castles were targets, and raids were often launched at night when defenders were weakest. To rest in such times was to gamble that the enemy would not strike before dawn. Many nobles kept armor and weapons within arm's reach of their bed, ready to leap into defense at the first alarm. Their wives slept lightly too, knowing that they might be roused at any hour to gather children, servants, and valuables, fleeing into the cold night as attackers surged through the gates. Nor were the nobles free from the same torments of the body that afflicted peasants. Their feather beds were luxurious, but lice and bedbugs still nested within, biting as relentlessly as in the huts of the poor. Their food was rich and plentiful, but often poorly preserved, leading to nights of stomach pain and fever. A noble might rise from his bed in the dark, clutching his belly, cursing the spoiled meat served at supper. Physicians were summoned with their potions and bleeding bowls, but the remedies often worsened the suffering. In this too, wealth provided no shield, and nobles endured nights of misery that humbled them to the level of those they ruled. Superstition weighed upon the noble just as heavily as upon the peasant. The vastness of their halls seemed ready-made for ghosts, and many nobles were convinced that the restless spirits of ancestors or enemies slain in battle roamed their castles at night. Strange noises in the dark were attributed not only to draughts or vermin but to these presences. Chaplains were often asked to bless chambers, to hang relics above beds, to pray at midnight to ward off spirits. Yet even the prayers of holy men could not entirely banish the sense that the stone walls themselves remembered too much blood and betrayal to lie quiet through the night. For noble women, the unease was compounded by isolation. Separated into chambers of their own, they were surrounded by maids and attendants, yet often felt alone. They worried for children sleeping in distant nurseries, for husbands on campaign, for the safety of estates vulnerable to attack. Their nights were filled with anxious pacing, with whispered prayers, with the constant dread that messengers might arrive bearing news of defeat or loss. To sleep at all was an act of will, but their rest was rarely more than a few shallow hours before worry roused them again. Thus, the noble's bed was no more a sanctuary than the peasant's straw. The trappings of wealth disguised, but did not remove the dangers and anxieties of the medieval night. Cold stone, creeping vermin, betrayal, war, spirits each hovered over their uneasy rest, turning sleep into a fragile thing, easily broken, never certain. Dawn brought no guarantee of peace, but it did bring relief from the heavy shadows of the night, and for nobles and peasants alike, that relief was as vital as food or fire. Among all the trials of surviving a medieval night, none bore greater risk nor deeper dread than childbirth. For while hunger could be endured and cold withstood, while vermin could be scratched at and beasts driven off, a woman in labor faced the dark with her very life in the balance. In an age when medicine faltered and knowledge was scarce, the bringing forth of new life was a journey walked upon the edge of death. And when labor struck at night, as it often did, the household became a place of anxious whispers, flickering candles, and prayers desperate enough to bend heaven's ear. For the peasant woman, childbirth rarely took place in privacy. Her hut, small and crowded, could scarcely provide a separate chamber. Neighbors were summoned, midwives hurried through dark lanes, their feet guided by lanterns that threw uncertain light upon the mud. The mother labored on straw or upon a low wooden bed, her body racked by waves of pain that stretched through hours and often into the long night. Around her, other women murmured instructions and encouragement, offering warm water, cloths, and hands to grip. Children were shooed into corners, though they could not avoid hearing the cries, the sobbing gasps, the pleading prayers that filled the smoky air. The dangers were many. A labor too long could sap the strength of both mother and child, leaving them lifeless before dawn. A breech birth, where the child entered the world feet first, was often fatal in such conditions, the midwives powerless to intervene. Hemorrhage was common, blood pooling on the floor while attendants worked in frantic futility. Infection lurked everywhere, in the unwashed cloths, in the hands of helpers, in the air itself thick with smoke and dirt. Few women escaped childbirth without injury, and many never rose again, leaving behind newborns who often did not live past the week. Nobles, for all their wealth, faced the same dangers. In castles, noble women labored in chambers hung with tapestries, surrounded by attendants, but the risk was no less. Midwives with greater experience might be summoned, and physicians might stand by with their learned words. But when labor turned cruel, their remedies were as hollow as prayers. They prescribed potions of herbs or urged bloodletting to restore balance of humors, but such measures often weakened rather than strengthened. Noble women, expected to produce heirs, bore additional weight upon their shoulders. The survival of a lineage, the security of estates, the ambitions of entire families. Their cries of pain echoed not only with fear for their lives, but with fear of failing their duty. And when they died in childbirth, as many did, the halls of stone could not muffle the grief, nor the whispers of servants who saw in each loss the fragility of power. The night compounded the terror. Without sunlight, every flicker of a candle seemed frail, every shadow a looming omen. Women in labor feared the spirits, said to prey upon mothers. Demons whispered to steal newborns before their first breath. Families hung charms above beds, clutched relics, and muttered prayers to saints like Margaret, protector of women in childbirth. Yet each prayer was laced with desperation, for all knew that divine aid often came too late, if at all. The cries of a woman in labor at midnight could carry through entire villages, heard by neighbors who paused their own restless sleep to cross themselves, and whisper hope that the household would see morning intact. For the newborn, survival was no certainty. Many entered the world weak, their cries faint, their breaths shallow. Midwives baptized infants quickly if they feared death was near, pouring water while murmuring holy words, for to die unbaptized was thought to doom the soul. Tiny bodies were wrapped in cloth, placed at the mother's breast if she lived, or passed into the arms of another woman if she did not. Entire families measured their nights by such fragile beginnings, their joy often tempered by grief within the same hour. Travelers, too, told stories of childbirth on the road, of women taken by labor in barns or fields, their lives surrendered to the night with no aid but the hands of strangers. Such tales spread fear to all who heard them, for they reminded every listener that life itself was precarious, bound always to the risks of the body and the uncertainty of the night. Childbirth was not merely a personal ordeal, it was a communal one. Villages measured time by births and deaths, and each night of labor was remembered, whether it ended in cries of triumph or silence too heavy to bear. Mothers, sisters, and daughters carried the memory of each loss into their own pregnancies, fearing the night when they too would be called to endure. And men, though barred from the chamber, paced restlessly outside, hearing the cries and unable to act, their strength useless against this enemy that no sword could fight. Thus, the peril of childbirth was woven into the fabric of medieval nights, a reminder that survival was never assured, that life was fragile from its first breath. To hear a baby's cry at dawn was to hear not just new life but a victory over death itself, won in the darkest hours. Yet many nights ended in silence, and the household awoke to grief instead of joy. And in those moments, all the cold, hunger, vermin, and beasts seemed lesser trials compared to the cruel gamble of bringing forth life in a world so ill-prepared to protect it. If there was one sound that could slice through the heavy silence of a medieval night more sharply than the cry of a beast or the shriek of a child, it was the sudden, chilling toll of the church bell. By day, bells marked the hours of prayer, the rhythm of work, the calling of markets and festivals. They were the heartbeats of a community, reassuring in their constancy. But by night, when all lay still and dark, their voices took on a different meaning. To hear a bell at midnight was never a comfort. It was an alarm, a summons to terror, a sign that danger had already come, or that death itself was at hand. The church, usually the one-stone structure in a village of timber and thatch, stood like a sentinel. Its bell tower rose above rooftops, and its bell rope waited in the hands of priests or watchmen who knew that one pull could wake an entire town. At night, that sound rang with a dread that could not be mistaken. A slow, heavy toll might mean death, a villager lost to illness, a noble's child carried away by fever, a mother perished in childbirth. Families stirred at the sound, crossing themselves, whispering prayers for the departed. Children clutched at their mothers, too young to understand but old enough to feel the weight of mourning in the air. The toll did not merely announce loss, it reminded all who heard it that death was always near and that their own turn might be only a night away. At other times, the bell rang faster, more urgently, a frantic call that tore through sleep and scattered households into chaos. Such bells meant fire, the terror that stalked every street and thatched roof. Villagers stumbled into the night, clutching buckets and tools, running barefoot through mud to join bucket lines, their eyes wide with fear that the flames might already be consuming their homes. The bell clanged again and again, echoing across the fields, a cry for every man and woman to join the fight. Few could ever forget the sight of their neighbors' faces, illuminated by firelight, sweat and ash streaking their skin, the air filled with the screams of animals and the collapse of burning roofs. Long after the flames were out, the sound of that bell in the dark haunted their dreams. Worse still was the alarm for invasion. In borderlands or during wars, the church bell at midnight might signal raiders approaching, torches spotted on distant hills, or the clash of steel already at the gate. Its sound was urgent, rapid, desperate. Men leapt to arms, fumbling for spears and bows, while women gathered children and fled toward forests or the safety of stone walls if any were near. Panic reigned, for there was little time to prepare, and the bell's cry meant the enemy was already upon them. Some villages were spared, others burned, but all who lived in such times remembered the fear of waking from uneasy sleep to the terrible sound of the bell, knowing that bloodshed lay ahead before dawn. Even in towns and castles, the midnight bell struck fear. A noble hearing its clang might rush to the battlements, heart pounding with visions of enemy banners advancing in the dark. Merchants in their timbered houses might clutch their chests, fearing fire spreading through the narrow streets. Priests themselves trembled as they pulled the ropes, knowing that each toll carried not only sound but the weight of dread upon the souls of their flock. The bell was not a warning alone, it was a proclamation that the fragile peace of night had already shattered. Superstition wove its own threads around the midnight bell. Some whispered that its sound drove away evil spirits, scattering demons and witches who prowled the darkness. Others feared the opposite, that the bell's toll called spirits closer, marking the passing of a soul or summoning the dead from their graves. Children were told to cover their ears when the midnight bell rang, lest the sound itself curse them. And yet, despite such fears, the bell was indispensable, the only voice strong enough to carry across the night, uniting all within hearing under one terrible knowledge: something had gone wrong. For travellers on the road, the sound of a distant bell was both a comfort and a dread. It meant a settlement was near, a place of shelter from beasts and bandits. Yet if the bell rang at midnight, it meant calamity already unfolding, a village in flames or in battle. Many a traveller paused on the road, listening to the clang echo through the dark, torn between hurrying toward the sound in hope of safety or fleeing from it in fear of being caught in disaster. The bell at midnight was not rung lightly. Its sound cost the community dearly, for it meant grief, struggle, or peril. And so, when it did ring, every household felt its weight. Mothers woke their children, fathers grabbed tools or weapons, elders knelt in prayer. Sleep was banished, replaced by action or mourning. And long after the sound faded, the dread it carried lingered in every ear, a reminder that the night was never safe, never still, and that survival until dawn was always uncertain. Thus, the church bell stood as the voice of the medieval night, sometimes tolling death, sometimes fire, sometimes war. Each strike upon its bronze body was a wound upon the hearts of those who heard it, a summons to remember their own fragility. And when silence returned after its last toll, that silence was heavier, darker, as though the world itself bowed under the weight of what had passed. To survive such a night was to know relief. When dawn finally broke, the bell quiet once more, its rope hanging slack until the next calamity called it to life. Sleep, in the medieval world, was never the gentle, unbroken refuge it is imagined to be in later centuries. It came in fragments, in stolen stretches of rest snatched between fears, in fits and starts torn by cold, hunger, or the cries of beasts outside. Night was long, and true sleep was rare, for it seemed that everything conspired to rob men and women of rest. Thus, sleep itself was often described as a thief, a thing that slipped away when most needed, a blessing withheld, a treasure always pursued yet seldom caught. Unlike the modern expectation of a continuous night's rest, medieval people often slept in two distinct phases: first sleep and second sleep. The first began soon after sundown, when darkness fell so absolute that little else could be done. Families lay down upon straw or pallets, closing their eyes as fire dimmed to embers. Yet after some hours, they awoke not refreshed, but restless. In this time, between midnight and dawn, men rose to stoke the fire, women rose to nurse children, and prayers were whispered into the silence. Some believed this waking was natural, even divinely ordained, a time for contemplation, for small tasks, or for guarding against the night's dangers. Only later did the second sleep descend, carrying them through to dawn. But whether ordained or accidental, this rhythm left men weary, their rest fractured, their dreams never long enough to soothe. Even in these stretches of sleep, disturbances were endless. The cold gnawed at bodies, jerking them awake with shivers. Vermin crept across skin, their bites driving men to scratching fits that broke the stillness. Hunger twisted the stomach, forcing dreams of banquets that dissolved into painful waking. The cough of a sick child, the moan of a fevered parent, the restless shifting of animals kept too close, all rose to drag sleepers back into consciousness. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, it was shallow, often filled with visions more troubling than peace. Dreams themselves were feared and studied. In an age when the supernatural was woven into every understanding, dreams were not idle fancies but messages from beyond. A vision of falling might be taken as a warning of sin, a dream of fire as a sign of coming disaster. Men awoke in cold sweat, their minds troubled not only by the dream but by the meaning it carried. Priests spoke of dreams as tools of God or tricks of the devil, and thus, even in the deepest moments of slumber, sleep did not truly protect. It opened the door to yet another realm of fear. To wake from a nightmare in the black hours before dawn was to carry its weight heavily, the images lingering long after eyes opened, the heart racing as if the vision might still be lurking in the room. For nobles, sleep was no kinder. Their feather mattresses might seem soft, but they were breeding grounds for lice and bedbugs. Curtains hung heavy about their beds to trap warmth, yet those same curtains enclosed stale air, thick with smoke from braziers. Guards kept watch outside chambers, but footsteps in the hall could rouse a noble instantly, mind racing with thoughts of betrayal or invasion. Many nobles took their sleep in fragments, waking to pace their rooms, to write letters, to pray in chapels, before returning to bed. Their rest was a wary thing, half surrendered, never complete. Monks and nuns, devoted to religious rhythms, were required to rise in the dark hours for prayers, breaking sleep deliberately. At midnight or shortly after, bells called them from beds to chant in cold chapels, their voices echoing through stone halls while the world outside lay shrouded in silence. This discipline was holy, yet it carried the same toll. Bodies worn by interrupted sleep, minds dulled by constant waking. For them, sleeplessness was a form of sacrifice, but it still left them vulnerable to sickness, fatigue, and the same weariness that burdened all. Travellers fared worst of all. Inns were crowded, their common rooms filled with strangers lying side by side, their snores, coughs, and mutters making true rest impossible. Straw pallets crawled with vermin, and drunken quarrels often broke out, waking the room in shouting and blows. Those who slept outdoors found their sleep even thinner, disturbed by the cry of beasts, the chill of wind, the fear of thieves. A man might doze for minutes at a time, his hand still upon his knife, never daring to sink into true slumber. To wake with the dawn alive was triumph enough. To wake refreshed was too much to hope. The thief of sleep robbed not only hours of rest but also strength for the day to come. Men rose groggy, their limbs heavy, their minds clouded. Fields demanded labor, but bodies ached from broken nights. Craftsmen bent over their tools, eyes blinking with fatigue. Women at looms or at hearths fought yawns as they tended their children. And so the cycle continued. Weariness leading to vulnerability, vulnerability leading to sickness, sickness leading to nights of even greater unrest. It was a spiral that deepened with each season, robbing vitality as surely as hunger or cold. Thus, the medieval night was never truly a time of rest. Sleep was chased but seldom caught, granted but seldom held. Each dawn found people weary, their strength drawn thin, their minds dulled. Yet they rose, for life demanded labor, and the night would come again with all its burdens. In this way, sleep itself became one more hazard, a blessing withheld, a fragile dream stolen by the very conditions of existence. The thief of sleep prowled as surely as wolves or spirits, and his theft was measured in lives shortened, in health eroded, in dreams haunted. To survive a night in the medieval world was not merely to wake alive, it was to wake at all, despite every force, seen and unseen, conspiring to keep one from rest. While most households wrestled with broken sleep and fearful dreams, there were always some who could not afford the luxury of rest, for the night was also a time of labor. The medieval world did not stop turning when the sun sank. Its survival depended on those who worked in silence and shadow, their tasks unseen by most, their dangers often doubled by the darkness. These hidden workers, bakers, smiths, millers, guards of livestock, and countless others carried the burden of keeping life moving when all else lay still. Yet their toil was fraught with risk, for to labor in the night was to expose oneself to every peril of darkness, without the shield of a sleeping household. The baker was perhaps the most familiar of these figures, rising long before dawn to prepare bread for the village or town. Flour was mixed by lantern light, the coarse grains sticking to hands, while the hearth glowed dimly in the corner. Ovens had to be kindled hours before sunrise, so that loaves would be ready when families stirred from restless beds. The baker's work was steady, but the danger lay in fire and fatigue. Sparks leapt easily from ovens, and flour dust itself could flare into sudden flame. Many a baker's shop had burned before dawn, the culprit not malice but the quiet treachery of embers. Alone, or with a few apprentices, bakers toiled in the chill hours, their backs aching, their eyes smarting from smoke, while outside the streets were silent, save for the steps of watchmen and the whispers of those who lingered where they ought not. Smiths, too, sometimes worked into the night, their forges glowing like beacons in the dark. A blacksmith mending a plough or shoeing a horse for early travel could not wait for daylight if the need was urgent. Yet to strike hammer upon iron in silence was to draw attention. The sound carried far, and thieves, knowing that tools and metal were valuable, often lingered near such workshops. The smith, though strong, was vulnerable, his focus upon his work, his weapons, the very tools he used. Many a tale spoke of smiths slain in their forges, their glowing fires betraying them to prowlers in the night. Even when undisturbed, the forge was perilous. Hot coals flared, sparks leapt, tools slipped in weary hands. In the dark hours, mistakes came easier, and injuries meant long suffering without hope of swift healing. Millers often found themselves labouring at night as well, for rivers and streams did not sleep, and the turning of the wheel could be harnessed in all hours. Grain was ground by moonlight or lantern, the creak and groan of the millstones echoing across otherwise silent fields. The mill, however, was a place of unease. Its great shadows, cast by flickering lamps, gave the impression of movement where none existed. Owls nested in its rafters, their sudden cries startling even the accustomed, and because mills were often built on the outskirts of villages, millers worked in isolation, their toil accompanied by the lurking fear of thieves or beasts. Rumours abounded that mills were haunted places, that spirits dwelled in the turning wheels, that demons lurked where water and stone ground together in endless rhythm. Whether true or not, the mill at night was a place where few wished to linger. Shepherds, too, bore their part in the hidden labours of night. Flocks could not be left unwatched, for wolves and thieves both prowled eagerly. Alone upon hillsides, shepherds kept their vigil by small fires, their cloaks wrapped tight against the chill, their ears straining for every rustle in the grass. Their lives depended upon their alertness, for a moment's drowsiness could cost the flock, and with it the livelihood of an entire family. Yet shepherds were men, and men grew weary. Many woke to find that beasts had struck in the moments when their heads had bowed, and the cries of lost sheep echoed across valleys as cruel reminders of their burden. Even within monasteries, night was no time of rest. Monks rose at appointed hours to chant prayers, their voices carrying softly through stone corridors while the world outside remained still. Theirs was a different kind of work, spiritual rather than physical, yet demanding all the same. Sleep was broken willingly, sacrificed for devotion, but the toll upon their bodies was no less than that borne by the baker or the shepherd. To labour in prayer was still to labour, and the night took its due. Women, too, bore hidden tasks in the night. Mothers rose to nurse infants, to soothe children, to tend fires and keep homes from freezing. In noble houses, ladies sometimes oversaw servants preparing feasts for dawn, or worked at spinning wheels in silence, their tasks endless, their rest sacrificed. Women in labour, as described before, turned households into chambers of toil and anguish, their cries a reminder that even the most intimate work of the body was fraught with peril when carried into the night. What united all these hidden labours was the ever-present risk. To work at night was to make oneself vulnerable. Lantern light drew attention, the sounds of tools carried further, the isolation left workers without aid should disaster strike. Injuries sustained in the dark were harder to treat, fires harder to fight, thieves harder to deter, and all the while, exhaustion pressed upon those who toiled, robbing them of clarity, dulling their hands, making each task more dangerous. The night gave no mercy to those who laboured, it only magnified their burdens. Yet without such work, villages and towns would falter, bread would not be ready for the morning meal, tools would not be prepared for the day's labour, sheep would be lost, prayers left unsaid. The hidden workers bore the weight of survival in silence, their sacrifices seldom honoured but always necessary. To glimpse a lantern glowing in a baker's window, or to hear the faint ring of a smith's hammer, was to be reminded that while most lay fitfully in bed, others faced the dangers of the night head-on. And so, in the medieval night, the hidden labourers carried their burden quietly, They fed the morning with their toil, but they paid in fear, fatigue, and risk. Theirs was a wakefulness that never brought ease, a task that never brought certainty. Each dawn that found them alive and their work intact was not only proof of diligence, but of survival, a quiet triumph against the countless dangers that made the night a place where men and women were never truly safe. If the medieval night was already burdened by hunger, disease, beasts, and fear, it grew heavier still in times of conflict. For war was a constant shadow over much of the age, and its presence was felt not only in battles by daylight, but in the long, watchful hours after dusk. Castles, villages, and towns never truly slept when war raged nearby. Even when walls stood high and gates barred, even when fields lay silent and no torch glowed on the horizon, the dread of sudden violence kept men and women restless. Night was when raiders struck, when fires were set, when enemies crept closest. And so, in war, the medieval night became not merely uneasy, it became a battlefield of the imagination, an endless vigil where each heartbeat measured the distance between survival and destruction. For the common villager, the threat was immediate and brutal. Farmers whose lands lay near contested borders lived in constant terror that raiders might descend upon them under cover of night. The crackle of fire in the distance could mean fields aflame, barns reduced to ash, livestock driven off, families huddled in their huts, listening for the tramp of boots or the neigh of unfamiliar horses. Sometimes the alarm bell would toll, rousing all to flight. Mothers clutched children, fathers grasped whatever crude weapons they could find, and whole villages fled into forests, leaving homes vulnerable. Many returned at dawn only to find their lives burned away in the night, their neighbours slain or vanished. Castles bore the burden of defence, and their nights were filled with tension. Guards paced ramparts, torches flickering in the wind, their eyes straining against the darkness for signs of movement. Every shift in the shadows below might be a raiding party creeping close, every distant light a torch carried by enemies. Nobles and their households rarely slept deeply in such times. Armour lay ready, weapons close at hand. The sound of a horn or the sudden cry of 2 arms could break the fragile peace at any moment. Lords often walked their walls at midnight, checking that sentries were awake, for the fate of their lands depended upon vigilance. They knew too well the tales of castles taken by surprise in the night, their gates forced open, their halls turned into slaughterhouses before dawn. Sieges, too, carried their own peculiar torments. When an enemy camped outside a fortress, the nights within grew unbearable. The silence beyond the walls was never trusted, for it might conceal miners digging tunnels to collapse towers or sappers preparing to set fires. At times, raiders attempted scaling ladders in the dark, hoping to overwhelm weary guards. Inside, defenders kept watch without rest, nerves fraying, eyes burning from lack of sleep. Hunger often accompanied these vigils as supplies dwindled. Families lay awake, listening to the enemy's drums or horns sounding in the night, cruel reminders that danger lurked only a stone's throw away. Even when no attack came, the waiting itself wore upon the soul, each night an ordeal of expectation and fear. For soldiers on campaign, the night was no kinder. Encamped in fields or forests, they slept lightly, their rest broken by the cold, by vermin, and above all by fear of surprise, attack. Fires had to be watched lest they give away positions, weapons kept close at hand. A sudden shout or the neigh of a startled horse could rouse an entire camp into frenzy, men fumbling for arms, stumbling into formation, hearts pounding in dread of an ambush. Many such alarms ended in false panic, yet each left the men more weary, more hollow-eyed, less fit to fight when dawn brought real battle. War consumed not only the day but also the night, stealing rest and strength alike. Even for nobles safe behind their own walls, war bred sleeplessness. Letters carried by messengers at odd hours brought news of battles lost, of allies slain, of villages burned. A nobleman might rise from his bed in the dark to pace his hall, weighing decisions, fearing betrayal, imagining armies marching closer. His lady might keep vigil in prayer, whispering pleas for the safety of her husband, her children, her estate. War did not confine its toll to the battlefield. It spread into chambers and chapels, into nurseries and kitchens, casting shadows over every corner of life. Superstition mingled with strategy. Many believed the devil himself moved most freely at night, urging men to violence, cloaking armies in confusion. Priests blessed walls and sprinkled holy water upon gates, hoping to keep both spirits and soldiers at bay. Yet when fires blazed in the distance, or horns called in the dark, prayers seemed frail against the roar of war. Some whispered of ghostly armies marching unseen, their tramp echoing across hills at midnight, omens of blood yet to be spilled. Whether real or imagined, such tales deepened the dread of every soldier and peasant alike. Children absorbed this fear in silence. They woke to the sound of bells or horns, to the rush of feet and the clash of steel. They clung to their mothers as smoke drifted through the cracks, as shouts and screams mingled outside. For them, the night became forever linked with terror, with memories of loss and fire. Many grew into adults who carried these scars, who never slept deeply again, always half ready to wake to the cry of alarm. The endless vigil of war robbed people not only of safety, but of the very possibility of peace. Even in times of uneasy truce, memories of past raids made sleep fragile, dreams restless. Men and women lay in their beds knowing that enemies might already be on the move, that dawn might reveal only ashes where homes once stood. The medieval night, already filled with countless perils, became in war a stage upon which survival was more uncertain than ever. Each hour stretched taut with fear, and so, in the age of swords and sieges, night itself became another weapon of war. It wore down defenders with exhaustion, it cloaked the approach of raiders, it magnified dread until hearts quailed. The endless vigil was a torment all its own, a trial that demanded not strength of arms but strength of spirit, the ability to endure fear without breaking. To see the sun rise after such a night was no small triumph. It was a victory, fragile and fleeting, snatched from the jaws of darkness. At last, after hours stretched thin with hunger, fear, cold, and the countless prowling dangers of the dark, the first pale shimmer of dawn appeared at the rim of the horizon. The medieval world greeted that faint glow, not with indifference but with relief so profound that it often felt like salvation. To survive, the night was never taken for granted. Every rooster's crow, every first crack of light spilling across fields and roofs, was a sign that one more battle had been won, that the perils of darkness had been endured for yet another day. The dawn was not merely the return of the sun, it was survival itself. In villages, the sounds of life returned hesitantly. From smoke-blackened huts, doors creaked open, and peasants stepped into the chill air, their breath visible in the morning light. They looked quickly to their barns and pens. Were the animals still alive? Had wolves come in the night? Was the grain untouched by rats? Each discovery of safety was a blessing, each loss a fresh grief. Neighbors emerged with the same wary hope, calling to one another, recounting dreams, fears, and disturbances from the night. Relief mingled with sorrow, for the dawn revealed both who had survived and who had not. The bell might toll for those lost to sickness, or whose huts had burned, but the living, weary though they were, gave thanks simply for standing once more beneath the Sunday. For travellers who had spent the night on the road or in woods, dawn was deliverance. The black shapes of trees softened into green, the hidden path revealed itself, and the distant silhouette of a village came into view. What had seemed endless shadow now resolved into familiar landscape. Wolves retreated, owls ceased their cries, and the night's whispers faded. A man who had sat awake by a fire, knife in hand, now lowered his guard, breathing deeply of the air that no longer seemed so hostile. To reach an inn or a churchyard by morning was to step out of exile, to return to the world of the living after a night spent on the edge of death. Within castles, dawn brought both reassurance and new burdens. Guards, weary from long vigils on the walls, sighed in relief as torches were extinguished and banners caught the first light. Lords and ladies rose from uneasy beds, their rest as fractured as any peasants, yet grateful to find no horns of war had sounded, no raiders breached the gates. Servants stirred fires, kitchens filled with smoke and warmth, and life began again. The night had passed without conquest, without betrayal, and that alone was cause for thanks. Nobles crossed themselves in chapels, whispering gratitude for the preservation of their households, though they knew the next night would bring the same trials anew. The dawn was also a time of reckoning. Fires that had smouldered unseen during the night sometimes flared into ruin, discovered only in morning light. Illness that had taken hold in the dark revealed its toll at sunrise. Newborns who had survived their first night were cradled as miracles, while others lay wrapped in silence. Fields might be found trampled by thieves or beasts, barns broken open, stores stolen. Dawn gave clarity, but clarity was not always kind. It showed what had been lost while men and women struggled to endure the hours of darkness. Yet still, the very act of waking, of opening one's eyes to the light, was treasured as victory enough. The medieval mind, steeped in faith, saw dawn as both earthly and divine deliverance. Monks rose to chant lauds, voices lifted in stone chapels that glowed with coloured light from stained glass. Villagers crossed themselves as the sun broke over the fields, whispering prayers of thanks that God had preserved them through the hours when devils and spirits were thought to roam most freely. Mothers kissed their children's foreheads, grateful to hear their breathing steady. Fathers murmured blessings before heading to labour once more. The light was more than natural, it was sacred, proof that darkness had been endured, that the world still turned. Children, too, felt the change. After nights of fear, they stepped outside into the safety of daylight. Shadows transformed into harmless shapes. The branches that had scratched the roof in the wind were now trees swaying gently. The cries of foxes and owls that had sounded like demons were replaced by sparrows and roosters. To them, dawn was a promise that monsters belonged to the night and could not survive the coming of the Sunday. Their laughter, tentative at first, brought warmth back into homes that had been filled with whispers of dread only hours before. Yet dawn was no final triumph, it was a reprieve. The medieval people knew that night would come again, with all its perils renewed. Each day was lived with the knowledge that darkness was waiting, a gauntlet to be run again and again. But that was precisely why dawn mattered so deeply. It was proof that survival was possible, that despite fire, hunger, sickness, vermin, beasts, war and fear, life endured. To rise with the sun was to declare victory, however small, over forces too vast to control. And so, each morning in the medieval world was met not with ease but with gratitude. Gratitude for safety, for warmth, for breath. Gratitude that the fragile walls had not failed, that the fire had not betrayed, that thieves had not broken through, that sickness had not claimed another. Gratitude that the night had passed, and that another chance had been granted. Survival was not assumed, it was celebrated. And in that simple act of waking, of stepping into light, medieval men and women found a kind of strength that carried them through the next day, preparing them to face the next night with its endless shadows. The dawn of survival was no grand triumph, no victory sung in epic poems, but a quiet resilience, repeated each day in countless huts, towns, and castles. It was the essence of life, in a world where night could so easily claim it. Each sunrise was a fragile, precious gift, a reminder that existence itself was uncertain, and that to live another day was the greatest miracle of all.